For over 2 centuries, the coastlines of Europe were not safe. This was not piracy in the romantic sense. It was an organized system of human capture and sale, operating out of North African port cities, Algiers, Tunis, Salé, Tripoli, with the backing of state power and the infrastructure of established markets. Raiding parties landed on beaches in Ireland, Cornwall, Sicily, and Sardinia. They took people from fishing villages, from coastal farms, from ships at sea. The captives were transported south, processed through slave markets, and sold. Some rode galleys. Some performed domestic labor. Some were never heard from again. Between 1530 and 1780, an estimated 1 million Europeans were enslaved through this trade. Entire coastal communities in southern Europe were abandoned. The English word slave raid entered common usage specifically because of these incursions. The history was real. The scale was documented. The people taken had names. This actually happened documents history's worst chapters, the well-known and the forgotten, to understand what they reveal about power, human nature, and civilization, because history demands to be remembered. Between 1530 and 1780, somewhere between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were taken from their homes, their ships, their coastal fields, and carried into slavery in North Africa. The lower estimate comes from Robert Davis, a historian at Ohio State, who spent years reconstructing the numbers from redemptionist records, ransom accounts, and Ottoman tax documents. He was careful. He was conservative. And even by his conservative count, the scale of what happened across those 2.5 centuries is almost impossible to hold in the mind as a single fact. We tend not to hold it there. That is the first thing worth understanding. The Barbary coast ran along the northern edge of Africa, from Morocco east through Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, city-states that were nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but operated, in practice, with a degree of independence that suited everyone. The Ottomans got tribute and a buffer zone. The corsair captains got license. The cities got wealthy on the proceeds of raiding, ransom, and a slave market that functioned as openly and as routinely as any other commercial enterprise of the period. Algiers was the center of it. By the early 17th century, it was one of the most prosperous cities in the Mediterranean world, and a significant portion of that prosperity sat on the labor of enslaved Europeans. At its peak, the city held perhaps 25,000 Christian slaves at any given time, a number that represents not a static population, but a constantly replenished one, because the mortality was high, and the ransoms, when they came, drained the pool. The ships went out and the ships came back, and the market in the harbor was restocked, and the city continued to function. That is what a mature slave economy looks like from the outside. Functional, ordinary, the brutality absorbed into the rhythm of commerce. The raiding itself was not random. It was organized, financed, and technologically sophisticated. The corsair fleets of the 16th and 17th centuries were not pirates in the romantic sense, small crews operating outside the law on improvised vessels. They were state-sponsored enterprises with investors, admirals, established routes, and intelligence networks. Captains like Hayreddin Barbarossa, who began as a corsair and ended as the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, moved between the two roles without contradiction, because the roles were not, in that world, contradictory. Raiding was policy. Enslavement was revenue. The ships themselves evolved to fit the mission. The early corsairs relied on oared galleys, fast, maneuverable in shallow coastal waters, ideal for swift landings and swifter departures. By the 17th century, they had adopted the square-rigged sailing vessels of northern Europe, which gave them range. Suddenly, the Atlantic was open. Suddenly, Iceland was not safe. In 1627, a corsair fleet out of Algiers sailed to Iceland and took somewhere between 400 and 450 people, nearly the entire population of the Westman Islands. The raid is documented in Icelandic records, in the testimonies of survivors, and in a remarkable memoir written years later by a pastor named Olafur Egilson, who was taken with his wife and children and eventually ransomed. He wrote about the smell of the ships. He wrote about his children crying in the hold. He wrote about arriving in Algiers and being paraded through streets that regarded him as cargo. The Mediterranean raids were more frequent, but the Atlantic ones registered differently, psychologically, in the European sources. There was something about the distance, the sense that no coast was beyond reach. A fishing village in Cornwall, a farming community in coastal Ireland, a small port in the south of France. Any of these could wake one morning to corsair ships on the horizon and find, by nightfall, that a portion of their population was gone. In 1631, the entire village of Baltimore in County Cork was taken, 237 people. The raid was led by a Dutch renegade named John Johnsoon, who had converted to Islam and was operating out of the Moroccan port of Salé. He knew the Irish coast. He had intelligence on the village. The raid took less than 2 hours. Of those 237 people, 3 eventually came home. 3. The word renegade appears constantly in the sources, and it requires attention. A renegade, in the language of the period, was a Christian European who had converted to Islam, usually under the pressure of captivity, but sometimes voluntarily, and who then entered the service of a Barbary ruler. The corsair fleets were full of them. Some of the most successful corsair captains were former Englishmen, Dutchmen, Flemings, Venetians, men who had made a calculation about where their prospects lay and had acted on it. This disturbed European contemporaries enormously, and their disturbance is itself a piece of evidence. It confirmed what they feared, that the boundary between Christian civilization and its opposite was not maintained by any deep structural force. It was maintained by circumstance. Change the circumstance and men crossed over. John Johnsoon was not exceptional. He was representative of a pattern that ran through the entire history of the Barbary system, the pattern of European participation in European enslavement. The ships were sometimes built in European shipyards. The navigational charts were sometimes purchased from European cartographers. The intelligence on coastal populations was sometimes sold by European informants. The institution fed on the civilization it was preying upon, and the civilization, in many instances, cooperated. For the people taken, the immediate experience was shock, and then a process of radical dispossession. Not just of freedom, of identity, of language, of the ordinary coordinates by which a person understood their own life. A farmer from Provence or a fisherman from Devon arrived in Algiers knowing nothing of the city's language, nothing of its customs, nothing of the social world they had entered, and found themselves assessed, valued, and assigned in the space of hours. The market determined what happened next. Skilled tradesmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, sailors, had value that kept them alive and in conditions marginally more tolerable than those assigned to manual labor. Women faced a different calculus entirely. Young men who were physically strong went to the galleys or to construction, which killed them on a predictable schedule. Priests and ministers were sometimes held specifically for ransom, their religious status making them more valuable as negotiating instruments than as workers. The galley slaves occupy a particular place in the historical record because several left accounts. Miguel de Cervantes, who would eventually write Don Quixote, was captured by Barbary corsairs in 1575 and held in Algiers for 5 years before being ransomed. He attempted escape 4 times. His accounts of captivity, scattered through his later writing, describe not melodrama, but the dull, grinding humiliation of having one's fate entirely in the hands of others. The waiting, the uncertainty, the way hope became its own kind of torture because it was never extinguished and never resolved. Ransom was the mechanism that gave the system much of its economic coherence. Captives who could prove they had families with resources, or who belonged to institutions, churches, guilds, municipal governments, with the capacity to raise funds, were held rather than worked to death. Their captivity was an investment. The Barbary rulers understood this perfectly, and the ransom process was sophisticated enough to have its own professionals on both sides: brokers, intermediaries, letter carriers who moved between the two worlds and took a percentage of every transaction. The Catholic Church established 2 religious orders specifically to negotiate ransoms: the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians. Over the centuries, these orders raised enormous sums, conducted hundreds of ransoming expeditions, and brought thousands of captives home. Their records are among the most detailed sources we have for the history of the trade, and the records are clear on one point: demand always exceeded capacity. For every captive ransomed, others remained. For every family that received a letter from Algiers, others received nothing, and the silence was its own answer. The Trinitarian records from the 17th century include the names, occupations, and hometowns of ransomed captives. Reading through them, and Davis did read through them, systematically, which is how we have the numbers we have, is an experience in understanding what a statistic actually contains. Each entry was a specific person: a weaver from Marseille, a ship's boy from Bristol, age 12, a widow from a village on the Ligurian coast who had been taken with her 2 daughters and was ransomed alone. The widow's daughters did not come home. That detail is not exceptional. It is the rule. For those who were never ransomed, life in Algiers or Tunis or Tripoli settled into something that was neither the dramatic suffering of the slave narrative genre, nor anything approaching normalcy. It was a suspended state, a life lived in permanent conditional tense. If the money comes, if the letter reaches someone, if someone remembers, if someone cares enough or has enough. The psychological literature on prolonged captivity describes a process by which the self reorganizes around the fact of captivity, not because the captive accepts their condition, but because the mind cannot sustain perpetual emergency. People adapted. They learned Arabic or Ottoman Turkish. They formed relationships with other enslaved Europeans, with their captors, sometimes with free Muslim laborers working alongside them. Some converted, and the question of whether those conversions were sincere or strategic is a question the historical sources refuse to answer cleanly, because the distinction may not have mattered to the people making the choice. Survival has its own theology. What the sources are clearer on is what happened to those who did return. Ransomed captives came home changed in ways their communities often could not accommodate. They had spent years in a world their neighbors had never seen, speaking languages that marked them as alien, carrying knowledge of Islamic practice that, in certain political climates, made them objects of suspicion rather than sympathy. The Inquisition interrogated returning captives, not all of them, but enough to establish that the institution regarded extended residence among Muslims as a kind of contamination requiring examination. Men who had survived years of captivity arrived home to discover that home was prepared to put them on trial for what they might have become while they were gone. Olafur Egilsson, the Icelandic pastor, was ransomed and made it back to Iceland. He wrote his memoir. It was read. The Icelandic community mourned the taken. But the vast majority of those 400 Icelanders, men, women, children, pulled from a subarctic island most Algerians had never heard of, remained in North Africa for the rest of their lives. Some are documented in later Algerian records under Arabic names. The thread connecting them to the Westman Islands simply ended. European governments were neither passive nor effective in their response. The distinction matters. The record of official reaction to the Barbary trade is a long catalog of naval expeditions that accomplished little, treaties that were honored until they weren't, and tribute payments that are the most clarifying detail of all. England, the Dutch Republic, France, Denmark, not minor powers, not states lacking military capacity, paid annual tribute to the Barbary regencies in exchange for their ships being left alone. The payments were formalized, budgeted, delivered. When the United States became an independent nation and lost the protection of the British tribute arrangement, it made its own payments, allocating at one point roughly 20% of the federal budget to keeping Barbary corsairs off American merchant vessels. 20% of the entire federal budget. That number does not belong in a footnote. It is a description of how power actually worked in the early modern Mediterranean, which was not according to the theories about European dominance that were being written at the same time as the tribute ledgers. The ledgers are the more honest document. Jefferson and Adams, in 1786, were sent to London to negotiate with Tripoli's ambassador, a man named Sidi Haji Abdrahman. They asked him, afterward, on what grounds his nation claimed the right to enslave European and American sailors who had done them no harm. His answer, as Adams and Jefferson both recorded it, was direct. It was written in the Quran. Non-believers were enemies, and every enslaved Christian brought glory and reward. Whether that was sincere theology or deliberate provocation designed to end an uncomfortable conversation, we cannot know. What we know is that Adams and Jefferson heard it, wrote it down, and then, because they were practical men operating inside a system of constraints, went home and for years continued paying tribute. The First Barbary War, which Jefferson eventually launched in 1801, is the more famous response. It is also, in retrospect, a marker of the turn, the moment when the balance of naval technology and political will had shifted enough that a state could choose confrontation over payment. The trade did not end with Jefferson's war. It continued for decades. It ended, practically, with the French invasion of Algiers in 1830, an act that initiated a colonial occupation that would last 130 years and produce its own enormous catalog of suffering. One system of violence displacing another is not the same thing as justice. It is, at best, a change in who holds the instrument. What stays with me, after spending time with this material, is not the scale, though the scale is real and should not be minimized, but the ordinariness. The way the system reproduced itself not through constant, extraordinary violence, but through routine. Ships left. Ships returned. The market opened in the morning. The ransom brokers took their percentage. The Trinitarian monks counted their funds and calculated how many they could afford to free this year. The European governments budgeted their tribute, and in Cornwall and in County Cork and in the villages along the Ligurian coast, people looked at the sea every morning with a specific knowledge of what it might deliver, and they went about their work anyway, because what else do you do? That is not a story about a uniquely cruel civilization on one side of the Mediterranean and a victimized one on the other. The European powers were running their own slave trades across the Atlantic during exactly this period, on a scale that dwarfs anything the Barbary regencies managed, with the same mixture of state sponsorship, commercial logic, and moral indifference. To note the suffering of enslaved Europeans is not to rank suffering or to rehabilitate the colonial project that eventually ended this particular trade. It is to insist that the capacity to build an economy on human captivity is not an aberration. It is not a feature of a particular religion or civilization or moment in time. It is a recurring answer to the question of what powerful actors do when they can. Power, when it is unchecked, does not ask whether its methods are monstrous. It asks whether its methods are profitable. The Barbary system was profitable for 2.5 centuries. When it stopped being profitable, when the naval calculus shifted, when the tribute became more expensive than the war, when European colonial ambitions found a use for North African territory, it ended. Not because someone finally recognized the humanity of the people being taken, but because the economics changed. That is the hardest thing to hold on to in this history, not the cruelty of individual actors. Cruelty does not require explanation. It is always available. The hard thing is the system, the way institutions form around an available cruelty and normalize it, formalize it, give it ledgers and brokers and religious orders and diplomatic protocols until the cruelty is no longer visible as cruelty, but simply as the way things work. The widow from the Ligurian coast, the 12-year-old ship's boy from Bristol, the 400 Icelanders who never saw the Westman Islands again. They are not symbols. They were specific people inside a specific system that processed them efficiently and forgot them almost immediately, and the forgetting was not accidental. A system that depends on captivity depends equally on the captivity remaining unremarkable. We remember the Barbary trade poorly, selectively, mostly when it serves a contemporary argument. That is its own kind of distortion. The better reason to remember it is simpler and more uncomfortable. Because it happened. Because it happened at scale. Because the civilization on the receiving end of it was also, simultaneously, doing something worse elsewhere. And because none of that complexity resolves into a clean lesson. It just sits there, in the Trinitarian records, and the Icelandic memoir, and the American tribute ledgers, asking to be looked at steadily and without the comfort of believing that the people who built this system, or the people who paid into it, or the people who looked away from it, were fundamentally unlike us.